I wish I could tell you it started the day she threw the bucket at me, but the truth is, it began far before that, in the silences, in the glares, in the little ways she chipped away at my dignity like peeling old paint. My name is Eleanor Matthews, I'm 72, and if you're listening to this, it's because I want you to know what she did to me when no one else was watching. I had spent my life as a nurse, a mother, a wife, and thought the war was over after my husband's passing. I didn't know the real enemy was already living under my roof, my daughter-in-law, Julia. She came into our lives with a pretty face, polite tone, and promises of care, but those faded faster than a cheap curtain in sunlight after my son Ethan married her. At first, it was little comments. Your mother spilled again. She forgets everything. We should put her in a home. Then came the food controls, the locked pantry, the cold stares, and finally, the violence. That day, I was down on my knees scrubbing the kitchen tiles because she said I left footprints. I hadn't. But when I told her so, she lifted the mop stick and struck my wrist so hard it cracked. Blood smeared onto the white marble. I thought she'd stop. She didn't. She hissed, "Clean it, Eleanor. You made this mess." And when I didn't move fast enough, she dragged me by my collar, slapped me twice, and pushed my head down until my bleeding hand touched the floor again. "Now scrub," she whispered. My bones shook, not just from pain, but from shame. I scrubbed while my blood watered the detergent. And all the while, Julia painted her nails in the next room. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at the small security camera my late husband had installed in the corner years ago, the one she thought was disconnected. That night, I crawled into my bed, clutched my bleeding hand, and whispered, "You've forgotten who I used to be, Julia." But I haven't. And the part that makes me tremble even now? The next morning, she told Ethan I fell and bruised myself, and he believed her. Or maybe he just didn't want to believe me. But I knew I couldn't fight this alone anymore. So I made a call. A call to someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone who once stood taller than any judge I ever faced in the hospital boardroom. Her name was Margaret Bishop, my oldest friend, and a retired lawyer. And what she told me when she answered that phone changed everything. Before you scroll away, I need you to hear this. What happened to me is still happening to women across the world who are told to keep quiet and smile through the pain. But I refuse to stay silent. If this broke your heart even a little, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. It helps more than you know. And I'm curious, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Your story matters too. The morning after Julia made me scrub the blood I bled from my own hands, I stayed in bed a little longer than usual. Not out of defiance, no, I knew better than that, but because my body simply couldn't move. My wrist was throbbing so badly I thought the bone might be cracked, and the skin on my palms had peeled open from scrubbing. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I, a woman who once ran emergency wards and stitched together the torn lives of others, had ended up being treated like a dog in the very house I paid to build. I still remember buying this place with Richard back in 1979. Every beam, every stone was ours. And now? Now I was a prisoner in my own kitchen. At exactly 7:30, Julia barged in with her usual icy smirk, holding a plate of dry toast and tea so cold it told me it had been sitting out for hours. "Eat it. You've got floors to finish," she said without a hint of irony, as if the blood stains from yesterday had somehow resurrected. I took the plate, not to eat, but to avoid another slap. That's how it worked with her: one wrong look, one breath too loud, and she'd unleash her fury. When I finally managed to shuffle to the bathroom, I locked the door and ran my hands under warm water, wincing as the raw skin stung. I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. My white hair looked thinner. My eyes, once sharp and full of fire, looked dull and defeated. But somewhere deep inside that reflection was the Eleanor I used to be, the woman who stood up to surgeons who bullied their nurses, the woman who raised a son as a single parent while her husband was off battling cancer, the woman who knew the law better than most hospital lawyers. I touched the bruises on my face, faint fingerprints from the night before. I pulled down the sleeves of my cardigan to cover the swelling on my wrist and opened the cabinet above the sink. I found my old cell phone, the one I'd kept hidden in a tea tin. The main phone Julia gave me had only one contact, Ethan. But this one still had numbers from years ago, including Margaret's. My hand shook as I tapped her name and hit call. It rang twice. Then, that deep, familiar voice answered Ellie. I hadn't heard her call me that in 30 years. It's me, I whispered. I need help. I expected her to ask what happened. But she didn't. She said, I'll be there by tomorrow. Don't say anything more over the phone. I hung up and tucked the phone back inside the cabinet. Julia was waiting by the door when I stepped out. What took you so long? You think you're on vacation? She sneered. I didn't answer. Silence had become my armor. She shoved a mop into my hands and pointed toward the living room. You missed the baseboards yesterday. I dragged my feet there, lowered myself to the floor, and dipped the cloth into water that smelled more like bleach than anything safe. As I scrubbed, I felt a rush of heat up my neck, not from exhaustion, but from something else. A spark. Maybe it was hearing Margaret's voice again. Maybe it was knowing that help was finally on its way. But something in me shifted. I looked at the camera above the television, one Julia didn't know I had reconnected the night before. My husband, Richard, had it wired into the basement years ago, and Julia assumed it died with him. She didn't know I still had the key to that basement. She didn't know I'd already downloaded 2 weeks of footage onto a hidden USB. She didn't know I'd kept every torn blouse, every bruised arm, every shattered dish she'd thrown in a box labeled Christmas lights. That night, she hit me again. This time, with a hairbrush, because I hadn't folded the towels to her liking. I didn't fight back. I let the brush crack against my shoulder, then I fell to the floor, harder than I needed to. I let out a cry, just enough to seem fragile, weak. She didn't even check if I was okay. She just stepped over me like a stain and turned off the lights. But I stayed there on the cold floor, smiling through the pain. Because I knew what was coming. Margaret Bishop, the woman who once tore down hospital administrators for age discrimination and sued a mayor for illegal eviction of senior tenants, was coming to visit. And this time, Julia wasn't going to see her as just some old friend. She was going to meet the hurricane I had summoned. I just needed to survive one more night. And as I lay there, staring at the faint red smear still embedded in the tile from yesterday, I whispered, tomorrow, you'll bleed words, Julia. Words you can't take back. The next morning, I didn't make the bed. I didn't sweep the kitchen. I didn't even butter the dry toast Julia tossed onto the counter for me like I was some animal under her roof. I just waited. She noticed. What's with the attitude today? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Her voice was low and sharp, like she was trying to slice through me with words instead of fists. I looked right at her, not with defiance, not with fear, just calm, practiced stillness. I have a visitor coming, I said. That made her blink. Visitor, she repeated slowly. Who? I could see the gears grinding in her head. Control was her religion. She hated surprises. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the hallway mirror and brushed my hair, gently, because my scalp was still tender from when she'd yanked it last week during one of her outbursts. You'll see, I said quietly. She laughed. A cruel, condescending laugh. What, your dead sister's ghost? Or did you dream up a social life in your sleep? She walked away shaking her head, but I saw the tremor in her fingers as she picked up her coffee mug. She was already off balance. She just didn't know how far she was about to fall. By 11 a.m., I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Julia rushed to the window like a watchdog and froze. Who the hell drives a black BMW at this hour? She muttered, her voice suddenly too small for her body. When the car door opened and a tall, silver-haired woman stepped out in a tailored charcoal coat with a briefcase in one hand and sunglasses in the other, I saw Julia's mouth tighten. Margaret hadn't aged a day in spirit. Her walk still had that courtroom rhythm, heels clicking with purpose. She didn't knock timidly. She knocked like someone who owned the place. When Julia opened the door, Margaret smiled in that way only powerful women smile, calm, gracious, and terrifying all at once. Good morning, she said cheerfully. I'm here to visit Eleanor. Julia blinked, trying to recalibrate. Do I know you? No, Margaret said, stepping inside without invitation, brushing past her like smoke through a crack. But you will. The next 20 minutes were like watching a rattlesnake slither across a porcelain floor, slow, silent, deadly. Margaret and I sat in the sunroom while Julia hovered behind us like a ghost with too much pride. "Ellie," Margaret began, loud enough for Julia to hear, "I reviewed the videos you sent me. The footage from June 12th, that slap, was especially useful. The timestamps, too." Julia flinched. "Videos?" she asked sharply. "What videos?" I didn't answer. I just stirred my tea. Margaret continued, "And the audio clips. That recording of her yelling, 'You're not a person, you're a burden,' that one's admissible in any civil court. State law allows audio from common living spaces." She didn't know that. Julia's face turned ashen. "What is this? Who are you?" Margaret stood, turned to face her directly. "I'm the reason you'll soon need a lawyer." "And Eleanor?" "She's not your servant. She's the legal co-owner of this home. And she's ready to make a claim." Silence. I watched Julia's mouth open, close, then open again, but this time, no insult came out. For the first time in over a year, she had no script to spew. And I sat there, sipping tea with shaking fingers, because for the first time in what felt like forever, the tide was turning. Margaret left after an hour, promising to return with documents and next steps. "Don't say anything," she warned me before leaving. "Let her unravel herself. It's faster that way." That night, Julia didn't scream. She didn't hit. She just watched me from across the kitchen as I ate my toast, hot this time, in silence. But her silence wasn't mercy. It was panic disguised as peace. I went to bed with a USB stick under my pillow and a quiet smile under my breath. I had spent months cleaning blood from the floors, hiding bruises under sleeves, whispering prayers that no one heard. Now, the law was on my side. The mask was cracking. And Julia was about to learn the one truth every abuser forgets: the people they think are weak are just waiting for the right witness. The next few days were almost eerie. Julia didn't slap, mock, or shove. She didn't even yell when I accidentally dropped a glass bowl. Instead, she moved around the house like a woman walking on a frozen lake, terrified to take a step without hearing the crack beneath her feet. But I saw it, the paranoia blooming behind her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the ceiling corners, the sudden obsession with unplugging appliances, checking for wires. She even disconnected the Wi-Fi twice, thinking I was secretly sending something through the smart TV. She had no idea that everything she feared had already been done. Every clip, every recording, every hateful word she ever threw like knives had already been packed neatly into folders by Margaret. We hadn't just gathered evidence. We'd weaponized it. And Julia, in all her cruel glory, had handed it to us with her own hands over months of abuse she thought no one would ever believe. But she was wrong. Margaret came again 2 days later, this time with papers, serious ones. A draft for temporary restraining orders, ownership documentation, power of attorney transfers, and a pre-filed claim for elder abuse, all prepared and waiting for my signature. "You sure about this?" she asked me while we sat in the same sunroom, the winter light spilling across the floor I once cleaned with bloody hands. "Because once this goes forward, it won't just shake her, it'll destroy her." I looked at her and nodded. "Good," she said. "Because she deserves ruin." But that night, something shifted. Julia knocked on my door. That had never happened before. "Eleanor," she said, her voice almost soft, almost human. I didn't answer. The door creaked open, and she stood in the hallway light, no makeup, no armor, no venom. "You really want to ruin everything? You want to make my life hell?" she asked, voice trembling. I turned, met her eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw fear give way to something else, desperation. "You beat me while I bled," I said coldly. "And now you're asking me to be kind?" Her lips tightened. "You don't understand what this will do to Ethan," she hissed. There it was. Not guilt. Not remorse. Just strategy. She didn't care about me. She never had. She cared about image, about survival, about not losing the only thing tethering her to financial safety, my son. "Then maybe," I said, "you should have thought of that before you made me kneel on broken tile and clean it with skin that was torn open." Her face twisted. "You're not innocent in this. You manipulated him." You made him feel guilty for leaving you alone. I stood. For the first time in years, I stood without shaking. He left me alone because you made him choose, I said. And now I choose too. She tried to throw one last jab. You think anyone will care about some old woman crying elder abuse? You think you're a victim worth believing. But what she didn't realize was, I didn't need anyone's sympathy. I had something better: proof. And Margaret. And the law. And decades of knowing how to fight battles in silence. I'm not crying, I said. I'm documenting. And then I shut the door in her face. That night, I sat at my small writing desk, took out the fountain pen my husband once gifted me, and signed every document Margaret had handed over. It wasn't revenge I felt. It was reclamation. Like each stroke of ink was peeling back the layers of filth Julia had buried me under. I wasn't just taking my house back. I was taking my name, my voice, my spine. And when I slipped the signed envelope into the mailbox the next morning, knowing the legal hammer was now set in motion, I didn't look back at the house. Because for the first time in a long, long while, it was finally mine again. The morning after I mailed the signed legal papers, I woke up to the sound of broken glass. Not an accident, I knew the sound of rage. Julia was in the kitchen again. She'd smashed a wine glass against the fridge, and now she was pacing in circles, barefoot, not caring that tiny shards glittered on the floor like landmines. You think you're clever? She hissed when she saw me watching from the hallway. You think you've won? Her voice was shaking, not with fear, but with the boiling panic of a predator who realizes she's been outhunted. I didn't say a word. I walked past her, stepped around the mess she made, and poured myself a glass of water. She hated my silence more than anything. Control had always been her weapon, and now it slipped through her fingers like ash. You think Ethan's going to take your side, she snapped, following me like a shadow. You think you'll get to keep this house? I took a sip and smiled without turning around. I don't think anything, I replied. I know. That set her off. She grabbed the mop, the same one she once forced into my bleeding hands, and slammed it against the counter. I gave up everything to take care of this house. While you sat around pretending to be some fragile little grandma, I cleaned your messes, cooked your meals, and beat me until I bled, I interrupted. Don't forget that part, Julia. It'll be in the court testimony. Her face paled, but her hands tightened. She wasn't done. That night, she tried again. She waited until Ethan came home, early for once. I was sitting in the living room, watching the news. She came out of the kitchen with a wet rag, walked right over to me, and without warning, tossed the rag across my lap. You spilled tea earlier. Clean it, she said, loud enough for Ethan to hear from the hall. He walked in just in time to see me pick up the dripping cloth with one trembling hand. Julia, what the hell are you doing? Ethan asked, stopping in his tracks. She didn't spill anything. Oh, now you're defending her? She snapped. She's trying to turn you against me, Ethan. You don't see what she does when you're not here. She breaks things, fakes falls, leaves messes for me to clean. You mean like the bruises on her wrist? He interrupted, his voice suddenly low, cold, calculating. She froze. What? Or the marks on her back. The ones you said were from her bumping into chairs. Julia's breath hitched. What are you saying? I'm saying I installed a second camera, Ethan said. One you didn't know about. Because I wanted to believe you, Julia. I really did. But last week, I saw you shove her into the cupboard. I watched the replay 3 times before I could believe it. Julia looked at me, not with guilt, not with shame, but with rage. Pure, unfiltered hatred. You set me up, she whispered. You planned this with him. With her. But I just looked at Ethan. And he looked back at me, eyes clouded with disbelief and something close to sorrow. How long, Mom? He asked. I touched my wrist gently. It started before Christmas. The first year she moved in. Julia screamed. Not words. Just a scream, the kind you hear from someone who finally sees their own end. She ran to the bedroom and slammed the door. Ethan sat beside me, his face pale and broken. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. Because you wouldn't have believed me, I said. Not until you saw it for yourself. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, breathing slowly. That night, Julia packed a suitcase. But not to leave, not yet. She had one more move left. She called her brother, a small-time lawyer in another town, and told him I was lying, that I'd forged documents, that I was manipulating Ethan with old lady tricks. But what she didn't know was that Margaret had already filed a notice with the county. Everything was already in motion. The storm she had unleashed, the years of pain, the blows, the humiliation, had finally become the noose tightening around her own neck. And me? I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. Ready to finish what I had started. She had made me clean in my blood. Now, she would drown in the truth. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Julia walked around like she had a ticking clock inside her chest, and every tick was a heartbeat closer to her ruin. She still cooked, still tried to smile in front of Ethan, but I could see the cracks forming behind her teeth. She was unraveling, and the more silent I became, the more loudly she exposed herself. I no longer flinched when she dropped a plate. I no longer bent to pick up crumbs from under her chair. I just observed, calm, calculating, unmoved. I had already fought the worst of the war with her. Now I was letting her destroy herself on the battlefield she built. But one thing she didn't realize was that fear turns cunning when it's cornered. That afternoon, I walked into the laundry room to find her whispering furiously into her phone. No, she's faking. She's lying. She's making it look worse than it is. Ethan's a fool. I need that paperwork gone. Find a way, just find a way to stop this before it hits court. I'm not losing this house to some withered old. She turned just as I stepped in. The look in her eyes wasn't embarrassment. It was venom. You shouldn't eavesdrop, Eleanor, she said with a tight grin. Bad manners. You shouldn't leave the door half open if you want your secrets safe, I replied. Bad planning. She stepped closer to me, and I could smell the desperation coming off her skin like sour perfume. You want a war? She whispered. You want to drag this through court, smear my name, humiliate your son in the process? I didn't start this war, I said, steady. You did. With every bruise, every insult, every floor you made me clean with torn hands. And now, the only thing I'm doing is giving the truth a microphone. That night, she changed tactics. She didn't yell. She didn't slap. She didn't throw anything. She tried something more sinister, sweetness. She brought me a bowl of soup, warm and fragrant, and placed it beside my chair like I was some respected elder. Made your favorite, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You must be tired after all the legal excitement. I looked at the soup, then looked back at her. What's in it? I asked plainly. Chicken, herbs, and a little mercy, she said. I smiled gently. Funny. You never served me either of those before. I didn't touch the bowl. I waited until she walked away, then poured it down the sink, because I'd learned poison doesn't always come in bottles. Sometimes it comes in apologies. 2 days later, Ethan left on a business trip. Julia thought she had one last window to act, and she used it. I was in the kitchen early, making my own tea, when she came behind me fast. Her hand gripped my shoulder and spun me around. You think you're so clever, she growled. You think you've trapped me? I know people too. I'm not afraid of court. I'll cry, I'll fake tears, I'll say you hit me first. Who do you think they'll believe? A bitter old woman or a grieving young wife? I didn't back away. I didn't wince. I simply said, try it. That word, so small, so solid, hung in the air between us. Try it, Julia. Try to lie in front of a judge. Try to explain how my bones fractured themselves. Try to explain the camera footage, the text messages, the bruises the nurse documented at my last checkup. Try to explain why 3 of the neighbors filed noise complaints on the same day you made me scream. Her face froze. I have all of it, I said softly. And Margaret has more. I turned back to the stove and stirred my tea. So go ahead. Try it. That night, I heard her sobbing in the bedroom. For the first time, it wasn't an act. She had finally seen what I'd become, stronger than she ever imagined. And I had something she never did, truth. But just when I thought she might break, just when I thought this would be over soon, a knock came at the door. A man stood there with a badge, a folder, and a somber expression. Mrs. Eleanor Matthews, he asked. We've had an anonymous tip. Someone claimed you've been abusing your daughter-in-law. And that was the moment I realized Julia hadn't stopped fighting, she'd just changed her battlefield. She was trying to paint herself as the victim. She wanted to flip the story. Destroy me before I could rise. But what she didn't know was I was ready for this too. I invited the officer in. I sat him down. And then, calmly, confidently, I handed him a copy of the USB. "I've been waiting for this," I said. "Now it's my turn to speak." I watched the officer shift in his seat, glancing between me and the thick folder I had just handed him like he wasn't sure whether to be skeptical or impressed. He'd come here expecting a confused elderly woman fumbling through panic. But what he found was a witness ready for trial, not a victim begging for sympathy. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we received a serious complaint." "We do have to investigate, and you should," I interrupted. "Because what you're going to uncover is not a case of abuse from me to her. It's years of assault, intimidation, coercion, and psychological warfare by her. And I've documented every second." He paused, looked at the USB, and raised an eyebrow. "What's on here?" "6 months of home surveillance," I said. 3 folders. Physical abuse. Verbal threats. Medical reports. Start with the footage from June 12th and July 3rd. And if your department needs more, my lawyer has backup stored offsite. I wasn't bluffing. Margaret had thought of everything. A separate copy had already been submitted to the county clerk in a sealed evidence package under a motion to protect against retaliatory claims. I could see it in his eyes. He was no longer here just for protocol. He was intrigued. His tone shifted. "And your daughter-in-law?" "Julia Matthews," I said. "She lives here with me and my son. But she doesn't just live here, she controls this house like a tyrant. She makes me clean floors with bleeding hands, locks the food away, punishes me when Ethan isn't home. And when I finally fought back with the law, she filed this complaint as her last card." He nodded slowly. "Where is she now?" I motioned toward the bedroom. "Pretending to be asleep. Or praying I wouldn't open the door to you." He stood. "Would you mind if I spoke to her alone?" "Of course not," I said with a smile. "But be warned, she's a performer. Just don't let the tears distract you from the evidence." He nodded again and disappeared down the hall. I waited. I made tea. I added sugar. I listened. First came the soft, startled voice, Julia's classic opener. Then the sniffles. The stuttering lies. The overacting. "She's unstable. She's threatened me. I'm afraid to be alone with her." But then came a long pause. Then a single word from the officer that made the hair rise on my arms. "So how do you explain this video of you shoving her head against the counter?" Silence. Thick and choking. A silence louder than any scream I'd heard in this house. He returned 30 minutes later, his eyes sharper, his voice different. "We'll be escalating this. I'm filing a request for a temporary protective order on your behalf effective immediately. She'll be asked to vacate the property until further notice. Do you have a safe place to stay, ma'am?" I looked at him with a quiet smile. "This is my safe place." He nodded. "Then she'll be escorted out." I heard the bedroom door open. Julia stepped out, her face stripped of every mask she had worn for years. There was no confidence left, no rage, not even fake tears. Just panic. "You can't do this," she spat. "This is my home." The officer replied, calm and firm. "No, ma'am. The deed says otherwise. And your name's not on it. But Ethan, he won't allow this." Ethan already gave a written statement backing his mother. "We spoke with him last night." Her mouth fell open. Her last line of defense gone. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me. "You think you've won, but I swear, the more you talk," I said, "the more you bury yourself. Walk away, Julia. While you still can." She left with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken glare. No servants to abuse. No audience to manipulate. No son to fool. And no more floors to bleed me onto. As the patrol car drove away with her in the back seat, not under arrest, but under strict restriction, I stood in the doorway of my home. The same doorway she used to block with her body like a wall between me and freedom. I looked up at the morning sky, clear and wide. I wasn't broken. I wasn't gone. I was rising. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Julia wouldn't disappear quietly. And people like her didn't change because they were removed. They changed when they were exposed. And I was about to expose everything publicly, legally, permanently. The storm had passed, but the real reckoning was just beginning. I had her lies. I had my truth. And for the first time in years, I had the upper hand. 3 weeks after Julia was removed from the house, the silence was strange, not peaceful yet, but no longer threatening. I could sleep without locking my door. I could eat without checking the tea for bitterness or the soup for toxins. I could sit in the living room and feel the weight of the ceiling lift. But peace is never a gift when your enemy still has breath. I knew Julia wouldn't vanish quietly. Women like her, calculating, entitled, venomous, don't go down with dignity. They claw for any scrap of control left. And, true to form, one morning at dawn, a courier arrived with a heavy envelope bearing a court seal and my full name printed in bold across the front. It was a civil summons. Julia was suing me for emotional distress, defamation, and elder abuse. Yes, elder abuse. The irony twisted like a knife in my gut. She had flipped the story, rewrote the chapters one had lived, and crafted a version of reality in which she was the sainted caretaker, and I the bitter, unstable mother-in-law who had lashed out after a slow mental decline. I sat there in my robe, holding the papers with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from fury. She was going to use the same system I trusted to try and silence me again, but not with fists this time. With lies. Legal ones. I called Margaret immediately. Her voice didn't waver. "Let her come," she said. "We've been ready since the moment she raised her voice the first time she struck you." The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I spent every day preparing, not emotionally. I'd done that already, but tactically. Margaret helped me sort the files again. We printed photos. We had the timestamps. Ethan gave his statement in writing. We had the nurse's report, the neighbor's signed account of hearing screams. Even the broken mop handle Julia once swung at me had been bagged and catalogued. On the day of the hearing, I wore my best gray coat, simple, dignified. I didn't want to look pitiful. I wanted to look true. The courtroom was small but packed. Julia arrived 10 minutes late, in heels far too high and a dress meant to look grieving. Her hair was styled in soft curls, her eyes red as if from crying. But I knew it was just saline drops. I knew her tricks. Her lawyer was younger than her brother, a cheap man with a cheap voice who tried to make the judge believe I had staged injuries and manipulated my son. I let him speak. I let him paint his fantasy. And then Margaret stood. When she spoke, the air changed. She presented the footage, starting with the night Julia forced me to scrub the floor with bleeding palms. You could hear the slap. You could see the blood. The silence that followed in the courtroom was almost holy. Margaret spoke with the precision of a surgeon and the ferocity of a mother protecting her child. "Your Honor," she said, "this isn't elder abuse by the defendant. This is elder torture of the defendant. For over a year, my client endured violence in her own home. And when she finally sought legal help, the plaintiff filed a retaliatory suit to muddy the waters. But facts don't bleed, Your Honor. Humans do." And Mrs. Matthews bled over and over, until she fought back with the law. Julia's face twisted with panic. She stood mid-hearing, shouting, "That footage is doctored." She hit herself with that mop. The judge banged the gavel. "Sit down, Mrs. Matthews. If you interrupt again, I'll hold you in contempt." And in that instant, it was over. Her case was dismissed within the hour, her restraining order request denied, and mine extended for 12 months. But that wasn't all. Margaret filed a motion to begin proceedings for ownership transfer of the home, citing abuse, falsified claims, and a breach of cohabitation agreement. Julia's name, already absent from the deed, now couldn't touch the property again. She had tried to weaponize the courtroom, but instead, she had handed us the sword. As she walked past me after the ruling, she hissed one last thing. "You think you've won, you miserable old witch? You think this makes you powerful?" I turned to her slowly, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "I don't think, Julia. I know. Because this time, I bled, but you burned." And I watched her storm out of the courthouse, heels clicking like distant thunder in a storm she could no longer control. That night, I didn't sleep in fear. I slept in my home, my home. The floors were clean. Not from blood, not from scrubbing, but from peace. And for the first time in years, I woke up without shame, without silence, without her. The court had spoken. The law had seen me. Julia had been exposed, her lies pierced like cheap fabric under a sharp blade, and she could no longer enter my home or my life without consequence. But what the court couldn't decide for me, what no gavel could fix, was the bruise that lived behind my ribs, the one that formed not from Julia's hands, but from my son's silence. After all the hearings, after the paperwork, after the officers and signatures and the cheers from the neighbors who had long suspected but never spoken, Ethan still hadn't said the words I needed. Not one, "I'm sorry." Not one, "I should have seen." Not one, "You didn't deserve it." And when you spend months wiping blood from tiles, hiding your wrist in sleeves, pretending your bones don't ache from the fists of someone who swore to be family, those unspoken words matter. They hurt. That morning, he came by alone. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen like he didn't know if he belonged in the room or not. I was making tea, because some routines survive even the worst wars. He didn't sit. Just stood, clutching a bouquet of white lilies that looked as awkward in his hands as he did in his skin. "I thought you liked these," he said quietly. I didn't look at the flowers. "I used to," I replied, before she threw a vase full of them at my head. He winced. "I didn't know it was that bad, Mom." I turned then, slowly, deliberately, looked him in the eyes. "Didn't you?" I asked. "You lived here. You heard me cry in the night. You saw the bandages. You saw how quiet I got, how small I became. Didn't you?" He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "When she made me scrub the floor until my skin peeled, where were you? When she slapped me for leaving crumbs, when she locked the fridge and laughed while I drank warm tap water, when she called me a burden, a stain, what were you doing, Ethan?" He swallowed hard. "Working. Trying to provide." I didn't want to believe it. "I thought you two were just clashing." "Clashing?" I whispered, nearly trembling now, not from fear, but from the grief that had lived in my chest for too long. "Is that what it looked like when I limped for days? When I stopped eating? When I forgot what joy felt like?" He set the flowers down on the table like they were suddenly too heavy to carry. "I failed you," he said, voice cracking. "I failed you in every way a son can fail a mother. I saw you fading and chose comfort." I let her twist the truth because it was easier than facing what I didn't want to believe. "I didn't protect you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull every bruise out of my skin and place it in his hands and ask him to carry the weight I had borne in silence. But instead, I looked at the lilies. They were beautiful, soft, fragrant. And still, they reminded me of a woman who tried to kill my spirit 1 inch at a time. "She didn't just hurt me, Ethan," I said slowly. "She made me believe I was nothing. And you, by saying nothing, you helped her do that." He nodded, tears now freely falling down his cheeks. "What do I do?" he whispered. "How do I even begin to fix what I broke by standing still?" I stared at him for a long moment. Then I walked over and took the flowers, not to forgive, but to acknowledge the weight he had finally decided to carry. "You start," I said, "by never standing still again." We sat in silence after that. No tea. No words. Just silence that finally felt like healing, not suppression. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying and freeing. The deepest wounds we suffer aren't always from those who hit us. Sometimes they're from the ones who looked away. They say the courtroom is where justice is served, but I've learned something crueler. In the age of headlines and hashtags, reputations are judged not in court, but in comment sections. 2 weeks after the ruling, after the judge extended the restraining order and dismissed her claims, Julia did what cornered liars do best. She went public. It started with a dramatic online article on a second-rate gossip blog. "Abused wife of retired nurse speaks out. I lived in fear with my husband's mother," complete with a photo of Julia crying, holding a framed picture of Ethan, and painting herself as a martyr. She accused me of manipulation, gaslighting, and subtle violence. She said I threatened her with knives. Claimed I faked the bruises with makeup. that I created drama for attention because I was lonely and jealous of their marriage. But what made my hands shake wasn't just the lies, it was the comments. Dozens of strangers calling me a toxic old crone, a classic narcissistic mother-in-law, just another bitter widow who ruined her son's life. One even wrote, "Why would a young woman hurt a fragile old lady?" Doesn't add up. The mom sounds like the abuser. I hadn't cried since the trial. Not once. But that night, sitting alone in my living room, seeing myself described like a villain in the story I lived as a victim, I broke. Not because I believed them, but because I realized how easily people believe a well-dressed lie over a quiet truth. I wanted to disappear, but Margaret wouldn't let me. She called that same night. "You don't fight darkness by hiding from it," she said. "You expose it to the light. Do you trust me?" "With my life," I replied. "Then it's time you speak. Not through the courts. Through you." I didn't understand what she meant until 2 days later, when a young woman named Ava arrived at my door. She was in her 30s, soft-spoken but fierce-eyed, and introduced herself as an independent journalist. "Ms. Bishop told me your story," she said. She showed me the court documents, the footage, the medical records. "I've covered cases like yours, but never one this complete. If you're willing, I'd like to help you tell the truth. Publicly." I stared at her. And why would anyone believe me now? Ava leaned forward. "Because unlike Julia, you're not selling a sob story. You lived it. And I don't think anyone who sees your eyes will doubt that." It took everything in me to say yes. But I did. And 3 days later, I sat in front of a single camera, in my own home, at my own table, the one where I used to sit bleeding from my knuckles, hiding the pain. I told everything. From the first slap to the final scream. I spoke about how she made me scrub floors until I left skin behind. How she starved me, humiliated me, isolated me. I even held up my old mop handle, broken, stained. "This isn't just a cleaning tool," I said into the camera. This was her weapon. And now it's my evidence. The piece aired 2 days later. Not on a gossip blog, but on a major online platform with millions of viewers. It was called "The Truth Beneath the Tiles: One Mother's Fight for Justice in Her Own Home." And something miraculous happened. People listened. Thousands of comments flooded in, most of them apologies from strangers who admitted they had believed Julia's story. Others shared their own stories. Daughters, mothers, even sons. People who had lived through silent abuse behind pretty walls. The story went viral. And the same hashtags that once smeared my name now screamed, #JusticeForEleanor. Julia, of course, tried to clap back. She posted her own video, half sobs, half rage, claiming the footage was selective, that I coached my son and weaponized the court system. But no one bought it anymore. Because abusers can fake kindness. They can even fake tears. But they can't fake proof. And I had it all. She wasn't just losing public opinion, she was losing everything. The community center revoked her volunteer work. The yoga studio she taught at dropped her name from the schedule. Her friends, the ones who once gossiped about me at brunch, stopped returning her calls. The mirror she once polished with pride had cracked, and the woman inside no longer looked like a victim. She looked like what she was, exposed. And me? I didn't dance in victory. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I just sat at my table, now cleared of pain, and let the truth breathe. For the first time in years, my name didn't feel like something to hide. It felt like something worth saying out loud again. It happened 3 weeks after the interview aired. The house was quiet again, cleaner than ever, not just in the way the tiles sparkled or how the curtains fluttered gently in the breeze, but in the way the air no longer held fear. I had started humming again, something I hadn't done in years. Just quiet little tunes from my childhood as I folded laundry, brewed tea, watered the ivy in the kitchen window. I felt alive again. But I also knew it wasn't over. Women like Julia don't fade. They seethe. They rot in silence until desperation drives them to do something unforgivable. So I started locking every window, every door, installed a reinforced smart lock, added sensors to the back gate, and put 2 hidden cameras in the hallway and kitchen, just in case. Margaret called it cautious. I called it necessary. And on a Wednesday night, When the sky cracked open with thunder and the town sank into heavy rain, Julia struck. I was asleep when I heard it. A faint scrape. A rustle of fabric. Then the unmistakable sound of the side door creaking open, the one Ethan had forgotten to double bolt when he dropped off some groceries earlier that evening. My eyes shot open. I didn't panic. I didn't even get out of bed immediately. I just reached under my nightstand, pulled out the small remote Margaret had installed, and pressed the silent alarm button. No sirens. Just a quiet signal to the private security service on retainer and an instant email alert to the detective handling my restraining order. Then I waited. I heard the footsteps. Soft at first. Careful. Like a thief who still hoped she might find something left to steal. I stepped out of bed slowly, slipped on my robe, and walked down the hallway in complete darkness. I knew every creak in that house. I had lived in its bones longer than Julia had worn high heels. I moved to the hallway corner, just before the kitchen, and waited. Then I heard her voice. Low. Whispering to herself. This is mine. This was always mine. She doesn't deserve it. Old witch. She'll pay. She was opening drawers. Going through papers. I peeked around the corner and saw her, drenched, hair wild, mascara streaked down her cheeks, wearing gloves and holding a small bottle of bleach in one hand and a lighter in the other. My stomach turned cold. She wasn't just angry. She was desperate. Unhinged. She was going to try to destroy evidence, maybe even burn something to make it look like I was negligent. But what she didn't know, what made my heart steady instead of frantic, was that every step she took was being recorded. Not just by the cameras overhead, but by the motion-triggered unit tucked behind the spice rack. Audio. Video. Timestamped. Locked to cloud storage. She was already buried. Still, I stepped forward. Calm. Silent. Until I was just feet behind her. Looking for something? I asked. She spun like she'd been electrocuted. You, she hissed. You set me up. No, I said. You walked into the truth again. I just let the cameras roll. She raised the bleach like a weapon, hand trembling. You think you're untouchable now? You think you can just erase what you did to me, what I did? I laughed once, sharp and bitter. You almost killed me. You made me bleed in silence. And now you want sympathy because the world finally saw your face without the makeup. She screamed high and broken and lunged. But I moved faster than she expected. I slammed the pantry door between us just as she reached it and locked it from the outside. For years, she had mocked me about my slowness, my shaking hands, my brittle bones. But she forgot something. Fear sharpens memory, and revenge sharpens reflexes. She was trapped inside. Not hurt. Not harmed. Just locked in the same pantry she once shoved me into as punishment for forgetting to fold dish towels. I picked up the phone. Called the detective. She's here, I said. Broke the restraining order. Attempted to vandalize the house. I have footage. He didn't even ask questions. We're 5 minutes out, he said. Do not engage her further. But I did go to the pantry. I opened the small vent slot near the top of the door and said one thing. You always thought no one would believe me. You counted on the world loving your lies more than my truth. But you forgot the one rule of abusers, Julia. You never stop at one crime. You always go too far. And tonight, you finally went far enough. She screamed inside. Begged. Swore I had framed her. Promised she would go quietly. But by the time the officers arrived and opened the door, she wasn't crying. She was catatonic. Because she knew. This wasn't just a bad look. This was prison. The judge who granted my restraining order was the same one who reviewed the footage. The charges were elevated to attempted destruction of protected legal evidence and criminal trespassing. She was denied bail. Ethan, bless his breaking heart, came by the next morning and said only one thing. I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know how I didn't see it. I touched his cheek gently and replied, You do now. That's what matters. And as I watched the rain wash her footprints off my porch, I realized something important. She hadn't broken into my home that night. She had broken into her verdict. After Julia's arrest, the house finally felt like mine again. Every creak and corner no longer whispered fear, but hummed with quiet resilience. But as the weeks slipped by, I realized that my fight wasn't just about reclaiming my home or my dignity. It was about mending something far deeper, the broken trust and silence that abuse so often buries. One rainy afternoon, while watering the plants near the porch, I noticed a woman across the street, a new neighbor, eyes downcast, shoulders tense, moving like she carried the weight of the world. I learned her name was Sarah, a widow in her 60s who had recently moved here under the radar, seemingly escaping a past no one dared speak of. One day, I saw her through the window, flinching at a harsh word from her own daughter-in-law on the phone. That familiar tightening in my chest, the same I'd felt for months, told me she was trapped in her own quiet storm. I invited her over under the pretense of baking. The first time, she was hesitant, eyes flickering between hope and fear. But slowly, through shared tea, soft conversation, and the safe walls of my kitchen, she began to open. Her story echoed mine, the subtle cruelty, the isolation, the emotional erosion. "No one believed me," she whispered once. "They said it was just family drama." I squeezed her hand. "I know," I said. "But family isn't supposed to hurt like that." Together, we connected with local support groups, shared resources, and I introduced her to Margaret, who agreed to offer Sarah pro bono legal counsel. Watching her reclaim her voice was like seeing the first buds of spring after a long, cold winter. The walls that once caged her cracked, letting in light. And as Sarah grew stronger, so did I, no longer just a survivor, but a guide. A voice for those silenced. It became clear to me that justice wasn't just about courts or restraining orders. It was about community, connection, speaking truth to power. And that's when I started organizing small gatherings in my home, women like me and Sarah, who carried invisible scars but refused to be invisible anymore. We shared stories, tears, laughter, and plans. I became a beacon, not by choice, but by necessity. And every time a new woman stepped through my door, trembling but hopeful, I saw my own reflection. A woman who was broken but rebuilding. The fight against Julia had ended, but the fight for dignity, respect, and justice for women like us was only beginning. And I was ready to lead it. After helping Sarah find her voice and beginning to build a small circle of women who had suffered in silence, I realized something powerful was stirring, not just in me, but in all of us. The walls that once enclosed our pain were cracking, and the whispers of shame were turning into a collective roar. The idea came to me late one night as I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. What if we took our stories beyond my living room? What if we brought our pain, our resilience, our truths into the light, not just for us, but for every woman trapped behind closed doors? I called Margaret first, and she was immediately on board. "The law can only do so much," she said. "But public awareness, that can change minds, policies, lives." We started small, reaching out to local radio stations and community centers. I shared my story again, this time with more fire, more conviction, knowing that every word could be a lifeline to someone listening in the dark. Slowly, the invitations came, speaking engagements, panels, interviews. Sarah came with me, braver every time. Other women joined, their faces fierce with courage and their voices trembling with hope. We called it the Voices of Dignity. Our campaign wasn't just about elder abuse, it was about reclaiming respect, demanding safety, and shattering the silence that had allowed Julia's kind of cruelty to thrive unchecked for so long. We collaborated with social workers, doctors, even law enforcement to create accessible resources for victims and their families. The local newspaper ran a feature on us, a headline that made my heart pound: "Elder Abuse No More. Community Unites to Protect the Vulnerable." Not everyone was supportive, of course. Some whispered behind our backs, called us troublemakers, said we were airing dirty laundry. But the roar was louder. And it grew. In one of our meetings, a woman shared how her mother had suffered for years before she found us. Another spoke about her fear of losing her home if she spoke up. I saw in their eyes the same fear I had carried, but also the fierce spark of survival. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were warriors. The local council took notice. They invited us to consult on new policies for elder protection. I sat across the table from officials, sometimes shaking, sometimes steady, pushing for laws that would protect women like me and Sarah from the shadows of abuse. Every step was hard-won, every victory tiny but real. And every night when I went home, I no longer felt like the broken woman Julia had tried to make me. I felt like a beacon, a reminder that age doesn't mean silence, that wounds can heal, and that even in the darkest pain, hope can grow. The fight that started in my home had spilled into the streets, into hearts, into change. And for the first time, I believed that no woman would ever suffer in silence again. Months had passed since Julia's arrest, and the community was rallying behind our cause. The Voices of Dignity campaign had gained momentum, sparking conversations in places that once turned blind eyes. I was finally beginning to breathe freely, surrounded by friends, allies, and the strength of shared survival. But deep down, I knew Julia wasn't finished. Women like her don't give up power without a fight. One rainy afternoon, as I was preparing notes for a public speech, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was icy, controlled, Julia's lawyer. "Mrs. Matthews, my client demands a meeting. She claims she has new evidence that could reverse the restraining order and void the recent court decisions." My hands trembled, but I said nothing. Margaret's voice cut through the line with steel. "We'll be ready." The meeting was set for a neutral office downtown. Julia arrived with a smug confidence, her presence commanding, but her eyes betrayed desperation. She laid out a folder thick with forged documents and false witness statements, an attempt to claim I'd manipulated neighbors, coerced Ethan, and faked my injuries for personal gain. Margaret dismantled each claim with patience and precision. "Your evidence is fabricated," she told the judge present. "These witnesses don't exist. And this paper is forged." The judge's gaze hardened, unimpressed by the deceit. Julia's bravado crumbled before the courtroom's quiet dignity. When the session ended, Julia stormed out, muttering threats and curses. But I wasn't afraid. I had fought her with truth, law, and courage, and now nothing remained but the echo of her defeat. That night, I stood on my porch, rain soaking through my coat, but feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. Ethan joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "You're stronger than I ever imagined, Mom." I smiled, wiping rain from my face. I just stopped hiding. That made all the difference. The battle was over. Julia's attempts to break me had only made me whole. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my voice, not just for me, but for every woman silenced by fear. And I knew this story wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. After Julia's last failed attempt to undo the justice we'd fought so hard for, a quiet settled over the house, but inside, the echoes of all that had happened still lingered. It wasn't just the bruises or the scars, it was the weight of years where I felt invisible, unheard, and abandoned, especially by Ethan. For so long, his silence had felt like its own kind of violence. But that evening changed everything. Ethan came home unexpectedly early, his face heavy with the kind of regret that's been carried too long. I was in the kitchen, folding a tablecloth, when he stood silently at the doorway, eyes fixed on the faded bruise on my wrist, a ghost of pain I'd long tried to hide. "Mom," he said, voice thick. "I never realized how much you suffered. I was blind, and I let you down. Not just because of Julia, but because I didn't see you. I'm sorry." Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't rush to forgive him. Instead, I held his gaze steady and said, "Ethan, healing isn't about forgetting. It's about acknowledging the truth and choosing to move forward. I need you to see me, all of me, so I can finally be free." Over the next weeks, we began to rebuild our relationship from the broken pieces left behind. We attended counseling, talked about the pain and the silence that nearly tore us apart. Slowly, the space between us filled with understanding, empathy, and hope. I saw a new strength in him, one born not from perfect protection but from honest reckoning. And in that, I found my own freedom. Because truth, no matter how late, can set us free. And sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones fought within. After months of fragile peace, I realized that the war I had fought against Julia was only part of the battle. A new and far more insidious enemy lurked in the shadows of my once happy home, my husband Richard's legacy of silence, control, and unseen abuse that had silently shaped Ethan in ways I hadn't fully understood. It wasn't until a late evening, alone in the quiet study, that the true nature of this hidden torment began to reveal itself. I found a small, folded note tucked deep inside an old Bible Richard used to carry, his shaky handwriting confessions, dark and chilling, of plans and thoughts that had never been spoken aloud. The words detailed manipulations, threats, and sinister control, how he groomed Ethan with cold precision to perpetuate a cycle of fear and silence, instructing him to bury the truth, to never show weakness. My breath caught as the weight of years pressed down like a stone in my chest. This wasn't just about Julia's cruelty or my son's denial. This was a legacy of abuse rooted deep in the man I once loved and trusted, a poison that had seeped into my own flesh and blood. But I wasn't broken. Instead, I channeled that discovery into a fierce determination. I confronted Ethan with the note, and at first, his eyes widened in denial, then guilt, then tears. It shattered the walls he had built, forcing us both to face the darkness we'd ignored. I began gathering evidence again: old journals, whispered conversations caught on recorder, and testimonies from others Richard had manipulated over the years. Margaret stood by me, unwavering, as we prepared to bring this hidden truth to light in court. But this time, it wasn't just for justice, it was for liberation. The courtroom became a battleground not just for my survival, but for breaking the chains of silence binding my son and me to a cruel past. The hours stretched long, emotions raw and exposed. I spoke not only of Julia's violence, but of the cold, unseen wounds Richard had inflicted through years of grooming and lies. Ethan, testifying with trembling voice, finally named the pain he had buried, and together we reclaimed our lives from the shadows. When the gavel fell, it marked not just an end, but a beginning, a chance to rewrite our story with truth and healing. And as I left the courtroom that day, I felt a fierce, unyielding light inside me, a promise that no darkness could ever claim again. The days that followed the courtroom revelation were the hardest and most transformative of my life. After laying bare the twisted legacy my husband had left behind, and after Ethan finally admitted the truth about how he'd been shaped by Richard's cold hands long before Julia entered our lives, a new battle began, not one fought with lawyers or evidence, but with the fragile, tentative steps toward healing. Our relationship, once fractured by years of denial and silence, had to be rebuilt on the ruins of forgotten trust. It wasn't easy. Each morning brought with it a storm of memories of the nights I lay awake wondering if I was crazy, of the times Ethan ignored my bruises, of the cold glares that hid deeper wounds no one spoke of. Together, we started therapy sessions, sometimes sitting side by side in a room heavy with pain, sometimes alone in tears as the counselor peeled back the layers of our shared trauma. We confronted the unspeakable, the manipulation, the silent orders from a man who taught his son to bury emotions, to equate love with control, to see vulnerability as weakness. There were moments I wanted to turn away, to hide from the shame and anger that bubbled beneath the surface, but every time I faltered, Ethan's steady hand reminded me that this was our path forward. Slowly, words replaced silence. Confessions replaced denial. And love, messy, imperfect, sometimes painful, replaced fear. Outside the therapy rooms, I also dedicated myself to raising awareness about the hidden wounds of generational abuse, speaking openly about the legacy of pain that can lurk beneath family facades. I shared how abuse isn't always bruises and broken bones. Sometimes, it's the quiet poisoning of trust, the unseen chains forged by silence. The community began to listen, reaching out with gratitude and stories of their own. In those moments, I found purpose beyond survival. I found a calling. Yet, healing was not a straight path. There were setbacks, relapses into anger, the resurfacing of old fears, the ache of what was lost. But we faced them together. And as seasons changed, so did we. Ethan grew from a man shadowed by his father's sins into a son willing to face the truth, to protect, and to rebuild. And I, once broken beneath the weight of years of abuse, emerged as a woman reborn, stronger, wiser, unafraid. The silence that once threatened to drown us was finally broken, replaced by a new language of courage and hope. And though the scars would remain, they were no longer chains, but reminders of the battles we had won together. The storm that had raged through my life for years was finally reaching its crescendo. Julia, once the cruel shadow lurking in every corner of my home, was now fighting a losing battle against the truth, and I was no longer the trembling woman she thought she could crush. Months after the courtroom victories and the public campaign, Julia's desperation grew darker, her attempts at sabotage more reckless. But this time, I was ready to meet her at every turn, armed not only with evidence, but with an unbreakable resolve forged in fire. It began with small incidents, missing items that she claimed I had stolen, false accusations sent anonymously to neighbors and local officials, and a series of malicious phone calls designed to intimidate and unsettle me. Instead of breaking, I turned inward, gathering proof, documenting every interaction, every lie, and every threat. Margaret helped me file for a permanent protective order, ensuring Julia could no longer set foot near my home, and began the process to legally bar her from contacting me or Ethan in any way. Then came the moment Julia tried to strike at the heart of my new life, a package left on my doorstep, filled with vile letters and threatening messages. But this time, I refused to be scared. I took the package directly to the police, who launched an investigation that traced the threats back to Julia. The law was finally holding her accountable for every attempt to dismantle the peace I had fought so hard to build. The most satisfying moment came when Julia's final plan, a desperate lawsuit aimed at discrediting me and reclaiming control, was dismissed in court after Margaret exposed the fabrications in her case. Julia left the courtroom in tears, her power stripped away not by violence, but by the unstoppable force of truth and perseverance. And as I stood there watching her retreat, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: peace. Not because the battle was over, because in life, some fights never truly end, but because I had won the most important war, the one inside myself. I had taken back my home, my dignity, and my voice, and in doing so, I had become the woman Julia could never break. Standing tall, surrounded by friends, my son, and the community I had helped inspire, I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for every woman who had ever suffered in silence and found the strength to fight back. After the final court ruling that sealed Julia's defeat, the house felt like it finally belonged to me again, not just physically, but spiritually. The heavy weight of years of fear and abuse began to lift, replaced slowly by a fragile sense of hope. But healing wasn't as simple as turning the page. It was a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding not only the walls and floors, but also the broken trust in my heart and the shattered bonds with my son. Ethan and I spent long evenings talking about the past, the silences, and the wounds left unspoken for too long. He shared his regrets, his guilt for not seeing sooner, and his fears about the future. I shared my pain, my loneliness, and my fierce will to survive. Together, we forged a new understanding, one built on honesty, patience, and unconditional love. Forgiveness became a difficult but necessary step. Not to excuse what Julia had done, but to free myself from the bitterness that threatened to consume me. I began volunteering at the community center, helping women who were trapped in situations like mine, sharing my story to give them hope and strength. Friends and neighbors noticed the change, how I walked with a quiet confidence, how my laughter returned in soft bursts, how my eyes held light instead of shadows. Slowly, the garden I had once neglected flourished again, just like I was flourishing. There were days when memories still haunted me, when scars ached under cold winds, but I learned to carry them like badges of honor rather than chains. And on the day Ethan surprised me with a small gathering, friends, family, neighbors, to celebrate not just the house's renewal, but our new life, I realized that this was what true victory felt like. Not revenge or punishment, but peace, love, and the strength to start again. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the blood-stained floors or the silent suffering. I was Eleanor Matthews, survivor, fighter, and now, finally free. The day dawned soft and bright, as if the world itself had breathed a sigh of relief alongside me. After all the battles, the broken nights, the shattered silences, I stood in the sunlit kitchen of my home, the home I had fought tooth and nail to reclaim. The walls no longer whispered fear. They sang songs of survival and strength. Ethan was beside me, no longer a distant figure shadowed by regret, but a son reborn in understanding and love. Our bond, once fractured by years of pain and silence, had been mended through truth and courage. Together, we looked ahead, no longer prisoners of the past. Julia's name had faded from my life, her threats silenced by the weight of justice and the power of exposure. But the hardest part wasn't the court cases or the public battles, it was the quiet forgiveness that settled in my heart. Forgiveness not for her, but for myself. For all the times I blamed myself for not speaking sooner, for letting fear hold me captive, for the wounds I hid beneath smiles and folded sleeves. Forgiveness that allowed me to breathe freely, to live fully, and to love fiercely again. I started writing again, journals filled with pain and hope, letters to my younger self, and stories to help other women find their voice. Each word was a step away from darkness, a step into light. And when I shared this story, this journey of brokenness and healing, I found not pity, but strength reflected in the eyes of those who listened. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who felt silenced, trapped, and unseen. And it ended with a simple truth, that no matter the cruelty or betrayal faced, there is power in truth, courage in standing up, and freedom in forgiveness. To those listening now, I say, you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And your strength can move mountains. So wherever you are, whatever you've endured, hold on. Fight for your truth. And know that the light is waiting for you on the other side. Before you go, please like, share, and subscribe to support stories that matter. And tell me, where are you watching from? Because together, we are stronger.